Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today and for choosing to watch this powerful and heartbreaking film, Hunger Ward. My name is Lena Slachmuijlder, and I work with Search for Common Ground, which is a peace-building organization working across the world, including in Yemen. And these are important times for Yemen. There's a lot of attention and mobilization to really try and end the war and find a peaceful solution to the challenges that this country faces. And each of you, by joining us today, by choosing to watch this difficult film, you're making an important choice. You're showing that you care about what's going on and that you want to know more and possibly be part of how we can build peace in Yemen and stop the loss of lives, as we've just seen in Hunger Ward. The conversation we're going to have today is going to enable us to hear from different points of view. And I'm very appreciative of each of your choices to make this time. I want to start by hearing from the director of Hunger Ward, Skye Fitzgerald. Welcome, Skye.
Hi, I'm here.
Great, welcome. Now, you're the director of Hunger Ward, and your films have consistently taken you to telling stories in contexts affected by war. You've also done some films in your home country in the US. But I'm curious to know, Skye, what was it that drew your attention to Yemen and really compelled you to make this film, Hunger Ward?
Yeah, this film came out of an essential question for me, and it was simply, how is it that a child can die of complications from starvation in 2020 with all the available resources that we have in the modern world? And the film really was a quest to explore that, to not necessarily the why, but the how, and to pose a series of questions. How is it that a 10-year-old child can weigh 24 pounds or a 6-year-old child can weigh 15 pounds? Because I think it's so easy to be buried by statistics, 5 million more people move into famine because of an FTO designation, or 100,000 children could die due to acute malnutrition. And it's a different thing to focus on the individual, right? There's a researcher here in the state where I live in Oregon who uses this term psychic numbing to describe sort of the phenomena of being pacified by numbers. And he summed it up beautifully last week when he said the more people that die, the less we care. And I think that's really important. I think it's important because it's true to some extent, but I think it's important because it affects our response to real human tragedies of incredible scale. And in my view is that one of the ways around this is singularity, right? The power of individual stories. And I wanted to use that knowledge to focus narrowly in the film on these two clinics and these individual patients and caretakers, because we ought to care that a 10-year-old child weighs 24 pounds, right? And so ultimately our commitment was to that content, to bear witness to individuals and not shy away from whatever we find. And so even though we watched children die, despite all the best efforts of Dr. Al-Sadiq and Makia and nurses at both clinics, for me, if you look carefully, there's beauty everywhere, right? If you look for it. And for me personally, the work that Aida does, the work that Makia does, it's selfless, it's noble, and I find it beautiful even within such a desperate context. And maybe even more because of the desperate context. And so, this sort of led to one of the central tensions of the film, which is that between content and form. And so I really believe that form should follow content. And we felt that by trying to craft a movie that is composed, that's thoughtful, that puts the viewer in the room with Aida and Makia as they do this really important work, was one that would honor their work and honor these individual stories. So yeah, so that was kind of the essential question we started with.
Yeah, no, and it really does, it brings us so close, and it makes us really not able to turn away. And perhaps that's the most important experience that we as the viewers can have, thanks to this film and the choices that you made. Skye, I've been to Yemen as well as a peace builder, and it's a very tough place. It's tough because of all of the different armed groups. It's tough because of the lack of predictability of actually what might happen. And, a huge lack of trust and suspicion and all kinds of things. So I can only imagine how hard it was to actually get the film made. Can you tell us about some of the choices that you made in that context of difficulty?
Yeah, you're right. I think it's important to not lose sight of the fact that Yemen has been and continues to be a conflict zone, right? 2 weeks ago, the airport in Aden was hit by missiles, right? And a couple days later, Sana'a in the north was hit by airstrikes in retaliation. And so, journalists are detained and killed all the time. It's a heavily armed society. And so we looked at those risks with hopefully clear-sightedness and just tried to mitigate them as much as we could. And, one way, again, was by focusing on individuals. By working primarily within the walls of these really highly respected clinics and hospitals, working so hard to save children, we were able to mitigate the daily risk of filming in the open, publicly, where the risk is much greater. And that since our intent was not to do a film explicitly about the war, but rather the effects of the war and conflict on civilians and specifically children, this approach really, it dovetailed nicely with minimizing the risk to ourselves and our crew. And, that said, the very real danger to doing stories like Hunger Ward doesn't go away, right? I mean, Nabila Kwati, a local journalist for the AP, who we licensed footage from and we met with multiple times when we were there, was shot dead in front of his home in June. And a close colleague of mine, Adela Hassani, was detained in September and has been imprisoned and tortured for 4 months now, simply for doing his job as a journalist. And he's still in prison right now as we have this conversation. So, there are real and abiding dangers, and especially to the brave journalists who operate on the streets of Aden and Sana'a on a daily basis. And for my part, I applaud them all for continuing to get these important stories of what's happening in Yemen out to the rest of the world, despite these dangerous conditions.
Yeah, no, and it reminds us of, these are some of the reasons why also it is something that is often not in the headlines. The stories that you've told in Hunger Ward. So I want to bring in Jehan Hakim. Welcome, Jehan. And you are the founder. Hi, and welcome, Jehan. You are the founder of the Yemeni Action Coalition. You're Yemeni American, and you have family members who have experienced and continue to experience some of the things we just heard Skye talk about. I want to first ask you, Jehan, what was it like for you to actually watch this film and get so close to the stories that Skye and his team chose to bring us?
Yeah, thank you, Lena, and thank you to Skye for this film. I want to backtrack just a little bit, just to provide a little more context about me. My family migrated to New York from the Yemen in the 70s. And I have a lot of family in the States who have moved here for a better life. But I also still have a lot of relatives in Yemen. And since the war, I've been worried about them. Always get a sense of anxiety when I'm calling or messaging them and I don't hear back for some time. Thoughts race through my head of, could it be an electrical outage? Had there been an airstrike? The worry is constant, Watching Hunger Ward made me think of my family back home. It also made me think of my mothering, my own children who live with me here in California, in the land of privilege. I'm a mother of 4, and 2 of them are now in college. But I remember worrying about my children's developmental milestones, like so many other parents. When they were younger, their fine-tuned motor skills, making sure that they're rolling over, sitting up, walking. I chose to nurse my children. I also chose to blend fresh foods for their meals. Of course, I wanted to make sure their food was organic too, right? I had so many choices. I could go to the grocery store and had access to any kind of food my children needed. And many of us have these options. So watching Umayma crying from hunger, it was tough. It was extremely painful to watch. Umayma is 10 years old and weighed a little over 20 pounds. My 7-year-old is currently at 60 pounds and growing. Realizing this stark contrast is heartbreaking. And I can't even imagine what parents of children in Yemen who have to face this as an ongoing reality, how they cope with such pain, I cannot fathom.
Yeah.
I think also it was especially hard to watch because we are not talking about a crisis in the past tense. Millions of other Yemenis are hungry right now and are starving to death as we speak. So, what is happening in Yemen, specifically to the children who are malnourished, it's not just due to food shortages. I think that's important for people to understand.
Right.
And it's not also due to a drought or some sort of natural catastrophe. What is happening to the starving children of Yemen is man-made, it's highly political, it is preventable, and it can be stopped.
Thank you. And effectively, that's what I'd like to hear more from you. All of the hundreds of people that are joining us in this conversation, would like to know just briefly, how did we get to this place in the war in Yemen today? Just give us a brief summary of what's important for us to know, and particularly what's important for us to understand about the Western countries' engagement in this context.
Yeah, I think a lot of people hear about the war in Yemen and they remember the Arab Spring, which took the MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, by storm in late 2010. And Yemen was among those countries that poured into the streets. In a country that is highly armed, second to the US per capita. The protests were peaceful at the beginning. On the streets, there were women, marginalized communities, all kinds of warring factors, all calling for change, independence, and wanting to oust the 33-year running dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh. And the revolts, like I said, were peaceful until they weren't, until warring factions found that there was a vacuum that they wanted to fill. So, that was in about 2011. So civil unrest in Yemen continued for the next 3 years. Ali Abdullah Saleh stepped away and put Abdul Mansur Hadi in his place. But the political transition led to mass unrest. So in September of 2014, one of the warring factions, the Houthis or Ansarullah, staged a coup and marched down to the capital and took over Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. They put Hadi under house arrest. And from there, Hadi fled to Aden, which is in the south, which I believe one of the hospitals in this film was made there. That's when the civil war broke out between one of the factions, the Houthis, and the army that's loyal to the Hadi government. There were internal uprisings in the south and in different areas as well, all wanting independence. But something changed in March of 2015. As the Houthis got closer to Aden, Hadi then fled to Saudi Arabia. And what he did is he appealed for international intervention. Saudi Arabia then hastily assembled an international coalition. It came together to intervene in the war in Yemen. We often refer to this team as the Saudi-led coalition because it is led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And it includes a bunch of other countries that have gotten in and out of this coalition, but it has been consistently led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And what happened in March, on the eve of March March 26th of 2015, almost 6 years ago, Saudi Arabia, under the leadership of Malik bin Salman, who had just became Minister of Defense after his father passed in January of that year, they launched airstrikes on Yemen, abruptly escalating a local civil war into a regional inferno. And since then, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and like I said, the coalition, which has included Arab countries of Kuwait, Bahrain, Egypt, Sudan, Morocco, Senegal, have been bombing Yemen from the air. So for listeners who are thinking, okay, well, that's sad. So many countries are bombing the poorest country in the Arab world, but it's happening over there, far away. Let them deal with it. Actually, the coalition has been backed and supported by the US, the UK, and other partners. who have been providing the coalition with, for example, in the US, we train Saudi forces. We also maintain, repair, and upgrade the coalition's vehicles and aircraft. We provide the intelligence support and the targeting assistance. So if we remember in August of 2018, when a school bus was bombed.
Okay, we seem to have lost Jehan. So we're going to continue. We're going to continue our conversation. Skye, I wonder if you want to just say something more about the context. Jehan was saying something critical about the engagement of Western countries in that context before we bring in our next guest. If you would go ahead, Skye.
Yeah, sure. Let's just talk about the status quo in a nutshell, right? Because that was great sort of background to it. So, this conflict is often characterized simply as a proxy war, but it's far more than that. The reality, regardless of how it's built out, is that right now, there is an air blockade over much of the country led by the Saudi coalition. So the airport in Sana'a, right, is dedicated only to UN flights, which is an incredible barrier to medicine coming into the country, which is an incredible barrier to doctors coming in and out of the country, and patients who need long-term chronic care getting out of the country. So that's a major issue. The foreign sanctions on banks is also a major issue. It's caused in part an incredible spike in inflation, which has caused food prices to become simply out of reach for many Yemenis. So even when there is food in the markets, people can't afford it. And then there's, of course, the sea blockade as well because of the contested port of Hodeidah. So it's incredibly complex. It's not entirely accurate to call it a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's much more than that.
Right, thank you. So Jehan, we lost you for a moment there, but we did, Skye just helped us to see the connection of certain Western governments and their support of this coalition, as well as other policies, including sanctions, that further worsen the humanitarian context, as well as, opportunities to, even for NGOs like Search for Common Ground and others to actually do peace building work. Jehan, I want one more question for you. In founding the Yemeni Action Coalition, you said to yourself, there's a role that civil society can have. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what is it that you're really trying to achieve with this action coalition before we bring in our next guest.
Yeah, I apologize for that disruption. I don't know what happened, but I'm glad to be
back. We're happy you're back.
Thank you for filling in. Hopefully folks are able to really capture and understand what the role of the West has been and why this matters to American taxpayers. The motivation behind the Yemeni Alliance Committee are the memories I had of a different Yemen from my summer vacations growing up. Yemen was a piece of heaven on earth. It's home to mocha coffee for those who are coffee lovers, home to the rarest dragon blood trees. I welcome folks to look up Yemen's history before it became known for poverty and war. So Yemeni Alliance Committee is an action advocacy group. We're a group of volunteer Yemeni American organizers. So we have other full-time jobs. We were formed out of the Bay Area, and we have chapters across the country now. And we began protesting in 2014 when it was just a civil war. But things really changed in 2015 because it was clear to us that the support and the arms of the US is something that the coalition would not have the capacity and equipment to wage this war without it. So we are fueling the war in Yemen. The US is complicit in this war. So we started lobbying our lawmakers, and we noticed that some representatives didn't even know where Yemen was. So we had to bring a map of Yemen with us. Anytime we'd lobby, we'd bring a map of Yemen and bring some folks who've been impacted. Their families have been killed by airstrikes. And I think people need to understand that the people of Yemen do know that these bombs are made in the USA by companies such as Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Boeing. The Pentagon's budget makes up the largest percentage of overall federal budget of the United States. For example, in the US, in 2018, the budget was $732 billion. That's more than 10 countries combined. That's 16% of our budget. And when we think of where money is going when it comes to education and healthcare, that money is being pulled out of those sectors to ensure that wars like the ones in Yemen and elsewhere are continuously to be fueled and funded. When we think about our tax returns on April 15th, portion of that goes to that budget. So we are complicit as well. And I know that, sometimes we don't have a part, we don't have a vote in where our money goes, but we definitely do have a vote in who we vote for, and what kind of policies that we help push. After the Muslim ban was put into effect in 2017 by Trump, which is still in effect, actually, still separating families, we really began to try to push to change systems. So we started working with progressives like Ro-Khanna, anti-war groups who've been lobbying to end endless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Syria, and
Okay, we're having another technical problem with Jehan, but we've heard a little bit about what that coalition is, and we'll share the link with you as well to learn more about the coalition. So I'd like to bring in our next guest, who is Honourable Andrew Mitchell, UK Member of Parliament. Welcome, Andrew. So glad you can make it today. To all of our guests here today, I want to say that we unfortunately will not be joined by Representative Khanna. He had a last-minute schedule change. But Andrew, you've had an extensive career with the UK government. You've held various ministerial posts, and currently you're a member of Parliament for the Conservative Party. And just to remind people joining us today, Andrew, that in 2017 you traveled to Yemen to see the effect of the war firsthand, and upon your return you organized an emergency debate in the House of Commons. And so I'm very interested to hear what is it that you see as most important for the UK government to be doing about the war in Yemen?
Well, good evening, everybody. It's a privilege to join you, and I watched the film, which, as everyone who watches it will feel, is a desperate take on an appalling situation. I became involved because, as a humanitarian, I didn't suggest for a moment that I had the political solution to what was happening in Yemen, but I regarded the situation as a humanitarian. And you ask about British policy. British policy, of course, has been incredibly confused because, on the one hand, in Britain, a decision was taken by the government that supporting the Saudis was in our security and our economic interest for obvious reasons. There is cooperation in the fight against terrorism with the Saudi intelligence services, and we sell an enormous amount of equipment to Saudi Arabia. So on the one hand, we were part of the coalition, but on the other hand, our taxpayers were funding humanitarian relief. You had at one point the coalition trying to disable all the cranes in Hodeidah port, but on the other hand, British money being spent to try and get the trains up and running again. So the whole thing was extraordinarily confused. And very early on, I said that I thought that the policy was profoundly misplaced. This was, of course, before the appalling treatment of the Saudi journalist in the consulate in Turkey, and also before the jailing of civil rights women who were just standing up for their rights in their own country. And I went to Yemen. I think I still remain the only European politician who's been into North Yemen in the last 3 years or so. And I went because the UN, whom I knew very well from my time in government there, showed the Houthi leadership in Sana'a what I had said in the House of Commons, and the Houthis agreed that I could come, and the Saudis, I think, subsequently regretted it, but they gave me a visa to get into Yemen, and I went and I spent time in Sana'a, and I spent time in Sada as well, which it's been very, very badly damaged by the bombing. And in Sada, of course, I saw the demining team that was trying to defuse high explosives, and paradoxically led by a British major and funded by the British taxpayer. I went to a school there which had been very badly bombed. I was shown weapons markings which had British designation numbers on them. And yet in the tent provided by the British taxpayer were 30 children learning, and they were being taught with British textbooks, again, provided by the British taxpayer. And when I walked in, they all stood up and started singing a nursery rhyme, or what I thought was a nursery rhyme. And I remember asking the translator to tell me what they were saying. And the translator said to me, they're saying death to the Americans and death to the Saudis, but by dint of respect for your visit today, they've cut out the third stanza. And then I went from there to the hospital. The hospital had been supported by Médecins Sans Frontières in Sadr, and Médecins Sans Frontières had to withdraw because of the bombing. And I went up to the top floor of the hospital, and I saw what is always the saddest thing you ever see in the developing world, which is a malnutrition ward where terrified mothers, their eyes wide with fear, are cuddling badly malnourished children who also have wide eyes and distended stomachs and are in great pain. It is the most, I've seen quite a lot of despair, poverty and disaster around the poor parts of the world during my political activities in international development, but those wards remain the saddest, and you're sort of infused with a fury because you see on the one hand Britain being part of this coalition, and on the other hand the fact that British taxpayers are trying to put a sticking plaster upon the effects of what another arm of government has been doing. Well, you know, from my visit, I met, for example, Al-Samad, who was a senior Houthi in Sana'a and who was a dove and who wanted to negotiate and who gave all the appearances of wanting the British and indeed the Russians to intervene, and was wiped out in a few months later in a drone attack by the Saudi government. So he was a dove in the Houthis. Right. And you know, what I saw, which was so distressing and depressing, was that the twin beliefs that it was in Britain's economic and security interest were wholly wrong, because of course the more this war goes on, the more it will undermine Britain's economic interest and undermine the Saudis. And secondly, of course, in terms of security, I can't think of any way more likely to radicalize thousands and thousands of young Yemeni men than knowing that the death and destruction which rains down from the sky every night on their families and their communities is funded and helped and assisted by the British and the American governments. So in my view, this has been a terrible strategic misjudgment. Countries do make strategic misjudgments from time to time, and I think we've gradually been sucked into this. And you know, British ministers have talked about the need to get an agreement. There's a very skilled British international civil servant who is the UN Special Representative. You know, it's very slow. And I'll make this my final sort of opening comment. But you know, in the end, these conflicts end in one of two ways. They either end because there's an outright military victory. Well, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Right. Or they end because there is eventually some form of peace conference and some form of structure to bring the warring parties in. And you know, we did quite a lot of work on Somalia when I was in government, and actually we've made very considerable progress in Somalia, in fact. But what you have to do is you have to bring in the regional powers, you have to bring in the UN and the great powers, you have to bring in the different militias and the different warring groups, and you have to bring in what's left of civil society, because civil society has to rebuild from all of this. So in the end, you're trying to organize a free-ring circus to negotiate. And I believe that is what will eventually happen in Sana'a. But prescribing, as Donald Trump has done, the Houthis is a foolish, in my view, retrograde step. We need to try and do everything we can to encourage all parties. And I'm certainly not, I should make it very clear that I'm not carrying any form of flag for the Houthis, who have behaved appallingly in the Yemen, as well as all the other forces. But, you know, the Houthis were driven into the arms of the Iranians. This is a proxy war between Sunni and Shia. And, you know, the Houthis are, I think I'm right in saying, Yazidis. So then, so they're not going to, you know, they've been driven into the arms of the Iranians. And the suggestion that the Iranians are able to supply massive amounts of weapons into this conflict are completely ridiculous, because the Saudis have cut it off by land, sea, and air. And that's probably enough for me now, but I think the quality of extraordinary misjudgments that have been made by the international community have made this whole situation much worse than it was some years ago.
You've painted a stark portrait of what you still are able to evoke when you think of visiting those places, including the hunger ward that you saw with your own eyes. You've secondly just talked about how there are different incentives going on, incentives to make the war more severe, as well as incentives to try and actually rebuild and to a certain extent ignite a peace process. So I just, and until the incentives to actually ignite peace that has a win-win outcome for all of those stakeholders you've mentioned is sufficient, we won't actually see progress on that point of view. And Andrew, I wonder if you can just say, before I come back to Jehan for your comment on this, what is it that you think is most important for the UK government to choose to do at this point in time, given that you're characterizing it as a strategic misjudgment?
So I should explain, it's been a very long day. I meant, of course, Zaidi, not Yazidi. But my point is that, they weren't automatically an Iranian proxy. They've been driven to that by what has happened. I mean, I think that the British government should be doing a number of things. First of all, it should tell the Saudis that the bombing is counterproductive. I mean, no country has ever won a war from the air. And if you're not prepared to put in tens, hundreds of thousands of troops, then you're not going to win. You're just going to cause yet more anxiety, trouble, trauma, and violence on the ground. So the thrust of the UN, the thrust of Britain, France, and America should be to say, you've got to stop the fighting. You've got to stop the fighting. And if you have to do it unilaterally, then you do it unilaterally. And secondly, we should use all our diplomatic muscle, which is very considerable in Britain's case, with the Americans and others, to try and get people talking, to try and get the fighting to stop and the talking to start. And we should put more effort. The trouble is that the world has been knocked off the kilter on this because of this dreadful year of COVID and the huge difficulties that all countries are having themselves coping with it. And if that hadn't happened, maybe more progress would have been made on the Yemen. But the quite extraordinary failures to get movement needs to recognize that you can't just order the Houthis around. They are there, unlike the Americans and the British in Iraq, where they removed the police and the army leadership. The Houthis sat on top of the existing political and practical leadership in Sana'a. They're not easily going to be removed. And the international negotiators and the international community need to accept that their bargaining position is not very strong in that respect.
Right, thank you. So Jehan, we've heard, these two things that that Andrew is recommending: stop the war and incentivize a process for peace in the way that he's described that involves multiple stakeholders, including the Houthis having a real seat at the table. When you look at what it is that you're advocating in your civil society coalition, do you have anything you want to add or a question to Andrew?
Thank you. I hope that I'm not going to get kicked out again. To let folks know, there are trolls really following people like me in these advocacy spaces. So I just wanted to make clear that what is happening in Yemen inherently is not a sectarian war. Although tensions have began to grow, Zaydis and Sunnis have intermarried and shared the same mosques for centuries, I should say. But with respect to strategizing and policy, I think the international community needs to do more than just pressure the coalition, because we know that what is happening in Yemen is systemic. There are policies in place that have allowed for the West to support the coalition militarily with the sales of arms. I think what we really need to do is focus on canceling contracts, because the US and the UK, Germany, France, and Spain are the top 5 large arms exporters in the world. So it's not that we can just tell the coalition, please stop. I think that the international community needs to stop selling arms to the coalition. we all know that the Gulf does not have capacity to build F-15 or any of that equipment. None of these warplanes are made locally in the Gulf. They are being bought, and we know that war generates revenue. So there's profit to be made. The international community needs to focus on crafting policies to end support for the coalition. So like I said, end military support, and that'll include the logistical support, the targeting assistance, and end arms sales. And I think we can just start there, and because there's a lot of other support that we provide. But if we can just start there, I think that we'd be at a really good starting point when it comes to really building peace.
I'm going further than that. I'm saying, no, never mind about arms. Actually, I think it's quite a nuanced argument about arms exports. I've never actually called for an arms embargo, but I'm going further than that. I'm saying that the Brits should tell the Saudis it's got to stop, because they're not going to win it. And if they're worried about the Iranian, the Sunni Shia split, then they're going to get humiliated. They're going to get humiliated. And the Iranians are laughing up their sleeves. So I'm saying that you make progress by actually breaking up the coalition and saying we're not going to do this anymore. And I think the Saudis for a while now have been looking for a way to stop this and escape without being humiliated. And I think what is required is a much greater oomph in terms of negotiation on this. And I hope that the Biden regime and the reinvigorated global Britain will put their shoulders to the wheel and make certain that they drive this forward.
It's very interesting, if I can just chime in for a minute, because as you said, wars don't get won in this way, and the ability to come to a peace agreement needs to do so without that humiliation. Otherwise, it just won't be yesable for all the wrong reasons, perhaps. But it's really very important, that point that you're making, Andrew, for us to actually find a way to mobilize international attention towards a durable peace agreement. Skye, I wondered if you had any other comments that you wanted to make around this discussion, based on that you've screened this film in many different communities as well. Over to you.
Yeah, Mr. Mitchell, I really appreciate your full acknowledgement of sort of the muddled state response from both the UK and my own government in this conflict. And you've been to northern Yemen, as I have. You've watched the film, you've seen that we filmed both in the north and the south of the country. And Makia Maji, who is the nurse practitioner in the north that we worked with, she said to me at one point during an interview, she said, the way we feel about the current UK and American response in our country is they feed us and then they kill us. Why? Right? And she posed that question directly to me as an American there, working with her very closely in the clinic. And I thought that beautifully sort of encapsulated this tension, right? This tension of the muddled response of both aid flowing into the country from the UK, from the US, from Saudi Arabia, while the bombs are flying overhead at the same time. And that's incredibly ironic. And as is...
And it's offensive.
Yeah, of course it is.
Because it's basically punching someone in the face and then offering them a sticking plaster.
Right, and agreed. And I think one of there's a similar tension with the recent designation by the Trump administration of the Houthis as an FTO designation, right? Because I concur with you that they have blood on their hands in this conflict, just like the Houthi government does, just like Saudi Arabia does, just like we do, just like the UK government does, just like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula does. There are so many players, and everyone in some form has blood in their hands. But the inherent irony in designating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, while your government and my government have military advisors in the war room in Riyadh advising, theoretically, those bombing raids, that's a horrific irony to me. And I guess my question is, what can you do as a parliamentarian to push back on that piece of it? Because that's what we're doing here. We're asking the incoming Biden administration to issue an executive order in the early days of the administration to end all operational support for the Saudi-led coalition. What can you do in Britain in a similar vein?
Well, we need to lobby behind you, the Biden administration, in that respect, and I think there is a chance that will happen, because with majorities in both houses now, there is. I mean, I think among Democrats I spoke to, there is deep abhorrence at the way that Jamal Khashoggi was murdered in Istanbul, and I think that there's a feeling that Trump let them off, and it's simply not good enough. I mean, the point I would want to just add to what has been said already is this: that the problem is made far worse by the fact that there is no legitimate government in Yemen. I mean, had his term long passed. And of course, he was the only name on the ballot paper when he was elected, which isn't the sort of democracy that I understand. And he's also, for most of his time, being either holed up in Riyadh or on an Emirati warship, occasionally setting foot in Aden. He's one of the only heads of state I've ever come across who has to make a state visit to his own country. So, that makes the whole situation that much more complex and difficult to get movement on.
And I would push back a little bit that, I think there is a de facto government in the country, and it's the Houthis, right? And even though they're not globally acknowledged by nation states, with the exception of one, they do have a functioning form of government in the north, whether we want to fully acknowledge that or not. And
no, well, but they're de facto rather than de jure, I think. I don't know whether Jehan might want to add something on that point.
The question was whether the Houthi
no, I just thought
about
the governance of Yemen. I don't know whether, I thought you might want to just make some point on that.
Yeah, I think Yemen is currently under 80% control of Houthi control, right? So whether it's Houthi control, Hadi control, I think that doesn't really matter. I think the focus or the goal should be lifting the blockade, ending arms sales, and ending the role of the West. And when we think about the Saudis being embarrassed because this is a strategy that's not winnable, I think we have to remember that it's a moral imperative that the people of Yemen are not being punched. They're being bombed and starved. This is really dire. And 2/3 of the airstrikes that have been pounding Yemen have hit civilians. So these are violations of international law that the US and the UK have been complicit in. I think it's not up to the US or the UK to determine which way that the Yemeni government should head. Instead, that we should focus on what are we doing to ensure that the peace process is going to continue, and that can only happen is when we end this intervention and the role of the US and the UK, and let the sovereign nation of Yemen determine which way the government is going to head.
I mean, I agree with you that it's not for the British and the American administrations to involve themselves in the governance of Yemen. It is for them to try and make sure that the fighting stops, and as both members of the UN Security Council, try and make sure that there is a structure for negotiation. That, I think, is incredibly important. The Houthi control is, as I say, de facto, not de jure. And I think that they shouldn't. I mean, although possession is 9/10 of the law, trying to persuade and find ways of persuading the Houthis to negotiate and not just sit on top of this cauldron is incredibly important.
Yeah, I think the Houthis will be more than ready to negotiate, or any other warring party, if the West ends arms sales and ends military support. I mean, it's going to be almost impossible to talk with anyone at the table while the West continues to starve and bomb, the
yes,
Yemenis.
That's why the key thing is to stop the fighting. As you have so wisely said, I'm going to have to disappear, I'm afraid, in a moment. But it's been a salutary discussion, and at least we're all on the same side in wanting the fighting to stop and negotiation to start. That is how this will end eventually, and for the sake of the long-suffering poor people of Yemen, I hope it will be as soon as it possibly can be.
Thank you so much for the generosity of your time today. And we look forward to hearing and seeing more of you around this. Thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure.
Same here.
So as we pivot, I want to just hear from you. Maybe first, Skye, if you can share with us a little bit of, after having watched the film, people have questions to know what happened after that. And I wonder if you want to give us any kind of update of any of the people that we came to know through the film. And then Jehan, I'm going to come back to you to speak again about how we can all be part of some of the action going on globally around this issue. Skye, go ahead.
Well, there's good news and bad news, because we left the country immediately prior to the pandemic beginning. But there's good news even within the added pressure of COVID-19 ravaging the country. And that is that Dr. Al-Sadiq, Aida, as well as Makia soldier on. They are continuing to do this incredible work as medical providers to save children on a daily basis. And that inspires me, right? That inspires me to continue to do our work, because I'm even now, I am angry, right? I am angry that children are dying for simple lack of food, even with the global resources that we have to bear on it. And I hope that by championing Dr. Al-Sadiq and championing Makia's work, we can be one small piece of raising global awareness about this and marshaling action. In terms of the children that we show in the film, there's wonderful news. Both Abir in the north in Makia's clinic, as well as Omema in the south in the Aden hospital. They are both well on their way to recovery, have gained significant good weight, and are really thriving as children. And Makia sends us photos from time to time, and we get photos from Dr. Al-Sadiq as well. And since we've followed them, they're visually completely different girls. And in addition to that good news, there's even better news that both of the Makia and Aida believe that the stunting will probably be minimal with both girls if the current nutrition program continues. So we're very, very hopeful that they're going to make mostly a full recovery.
Excellent. Thank you. That's wonderful to hear. Really wonderful to hear.
I'm so happy to hear that as well.
Yes. So Jehan, as we wrap up this conversation, it feels as though we could unpack more and really try to understand better, what does it look like for mobilization to try and stop the war? What does it look like to advocate for the right incentives for a peace process? But tell us about what's coming up next week and other ways that people who've joined us today can be involved.
Sure, yeah, we've been at this for almost 6 years now. So we do have an action that we're organizing on January 25th, which will be days after the US presidential inauguration here in the US. It is also a day before Saudi Arabia's Davos in the Desert Future Investment Initiative. Saudi Arabia is trying to garner more funding, which was cut off after Khashoggi's murder. And Yemeni Alliance Committee and core organizers drafted a joint statement, and it's titled World Says No War on Yemen. It's in 5 languages, condemning the role of Western powers in the war in Yemen. So far, 200 organizations from over 20 countries have signed on to this joint statement. And we're really calling for an end to US support, UK support as well, and to Western support for the war in Yemen, and for Biden specifically to pass a war powers resolution with teeth. See, we were talking earlier, and I think language is important. We need to be really specific about what type of support does the West need to end. And it specifically needs to end military support, logistical support, targeting assistance, and arms sales. So we are pushing the Biden administration to pass a war powers resolution in his first 100 days. In addition to that, we are calling for the Western powers and the international community to restore and expand aid into all of Yemen. This also includes reversing the Houthi FTO designation if it is confirmed. Lastly, the blockade, the hunger ward really just illustrated how devastating hunger can hit, especially on children. So lifting the blockade and opening all land and seaports is the final ask. And on the 25th, there will be protests in New York, California, Chicago, Germany, around the world. And we're encouraging folks to hold protests or digital webinars wherever it's safe. I know that COVID is still alive and well, so please join us either online or on the streets. I mean, this is an anti-war movement and it's growing into a global one. So wherever you are, join us on January 25th and beyond, because we know that this war is over 6 years old now, and it's going to take all of us, all hands on deck. So follow us on social media to plug in.
Thank you, Jehan, and thank you, Skye. And to all of you that have joined here today, we will be sending follow-up information with many of the links about the global action to stop the war in Yemen on the 25th, as well as some other things that have been shared in the very vibrant chat during our conversation today. Once again, we've sensed and felt by your participation today that you care, that you want to look towards and not away from this humanitarian crisis. And I really invite each of you to try to find a way to contribute to the things that Jehan has talked about, or in other ways that you can. It's unacceptable, as Skye told us in the beginning, that people can die of starvation from a man-made conflict in 2021. And that's the reality that's going on every day. So Skye, you have your hand up, go ahead.
Yeah, just one. I just want to lead people to the resources we have on our website. So there are some questions about watching the film. We have 2 more screenings upcoming that are by RSVP on the 21st and the 26th of this month. You can find us on hungerward.org, where we also have for U.S. residents a governmental intervention outreach tool where you can reach your own senators, your own representatives, to encourage the efforts that are upcoming that Jehan has been speaking to, and reach out directly to intervene with those who represent you in the government. We also have a link where you can actually donate directly to the clinic and the hospital featured in the film. And those funds go directly to those facilities. So I just want to, that's all at hungerward.org.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, each of you, for making time on this Saturday to pay attention, to care about what's happening in Yemen. And we look forward to another opportunity. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lena.
Thank you.